the Australian Association of Bush Regenerators 2024 National Forum was hosted by our Victorian branch. Exploring the R's of ecological restoration, restoring biodiversity through resilience, regeneration, reintroduction, and reconnecting to country.
Our next speaker, Brian Bainbridge, is going to talk to us about assisted regeneration. He's going to share with us the success of a regeneration project at the Hepburn Shire. Brian has worked in ecological restoration since the mid-1990s. For over 20 years, Brian worked with the community-based not-for-profit organisation Merri Creek Management Committee. And over the past 6 years, as the Biodiversity Officer with Hepburn Shire, a small ecologically rich shire in central Victoria. In this role, Brian supports the Shire's parks, engineering, planning, and the wider community in their management of biodiverse spaces. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to share some examples of assisted natural regeneration. In particular, Alex, you came up with a really lovely title for my talk, which was Wait and See, because this is about the benefits of taking the time to observe natural regeneration potential. And also I'd like to talk about bringing community on board with these approaches, because it's not without its challenges, trusting nature. And we're lucky in the Shire in that a little flagship species has come along which has helped us to raise awareness and support for these approaches, So my role changed 6 years ago. I went from working with a whole team of people at MCMC on a largely urban creek line for over 20 years to working in a rural shire on Djadja country at Hepburn. You can see how large that is compared with the area I used to work on. The Shire's population is about 16,000 people, which is about the size of the population of the suburb I used to live in, Fawkner in Melbourne. So it's a pretty small rural shire. And so it's been a big investment for the Shire to actually employ its first biodiversity officer. But then again, Hepburn is almost half covered in native vegetation. It's a really, really amazing place. As the list explained, I'm a really busy bee. I have to look after all these biodiversity aspects of all these different parts of the Shire. I'm a team of one. I used to be in a team of 20. I have 2 people now. We work together, and I'm no longer primarily employed in ecological restoration. But when I came to Hepburn in 2018, there were a couple of projects that were there, and I actually had a role in having to retrofit some ecological principles and strategy to a couple of existing projects. The first of these was at Wombat Flat in Lake Daylesford. How many of you have been to Lake Daylesford in Daylesford? Yep, lots of you have. If you walk around to where the creek walks in, it's called Wombat Flat. This is what it was like in 2016, and the Shire decided to do some willow and blackberry removal. And so in 2016 it was covered mostly in sallow wattle, which is a seeding wattle. And this is what it looked like in December of 2016. There's a lot of trees on the ground there. This is what it looked like in 2018. The trees were still on the ground, but that green is actually a lot of natural regeneration that had occurred. There hadn't actually been apparently no firm plan for what to do after they cut down the willows and blackberry. towards the end of that year, I just began work there, they mulched the trees and they shoved the mulch into the low-lying areas of the, which were actually the anabranches and pools in the wetland. Not what I would have chosen to do, but I was busy doing other things, and then they brought me in. Subsequent to that, there's been a lot of further natural regeneration that has continued in that area. It's 2023. In 2019, I was introduced to the site, and I learnt that there were still no firm plans to restore the area. This is what it looked like in May 2019. The machines had gone across, they'd been scraping the trees and logs and mulching up the trees. So pretty dramatic, pretty drastic appearance. And I went, oh, okay, I've got no money or anything to do anything with, but okay, that's interesting. In 2020, late 2020, so another year goes by, I was asked by the LGBTQI plus community for a site to conduct a commemorative planting, an annual commemorative planting. And I thought, oh, maybe that site down at Wombat Flat would be a good place. We headed down there. And very much as Teen had identified, wetlands often have very high migratory and high resilience. And the site had actually regenerated really abundantly with native sedges, rushes, and so on. And all there really was to do for the chill out was to do little patches of revegetation, especially in the dry areas that had not regenerated so well. And reintroduce some species that hadn't managed to make it there. About the same time, a very similar project had happened at Lake Jubilee, also in Daylesford. Previously dominated by willow, this is what it used to look like. Very dank, very shaded, with mostly an understory of blackberry across the creek going into Lake Jubilee. In 2018, the Council also had another project removing willow and blackberry at Lake Jubilee. And by the time I was introduced to the project in about 2020, it had also undergone amazing natural regeneration. There'd been stalled projects, there'd been interruptions, and so there hadn't been the follow-up that had previously been planned. And as it turns out, was probably the best thing that could have happened. That's Lake Jubilee. In 2021, I found that over 40 species of native sedge, rush, grass, herb, fern and tree had recolonised. Tens of thousands of specimens of these plants. So for Lake Jubilee, there actually had been a plan to spray out the area and to replant 6,000 tube stock. And so once I saw what was going on, we said, let's change tack here. And we converted those trees, we converted that resource into further detailed weed control and just a much smaller reintroduction program. And that really fits well within the SCRA guidelines. So this diagram shows the order they suggest you should be approaching restoration work. Is spontaneous regeneration possible? Maybe not. Maybe you get rid of the blackberry and the willow, and facilitated regeneration is basically what was happening here. By removing the blocking transformer weeds of willow and blackberry, there was unleashed the natural regeneration potential. And we went backward. We sort of stepped back from doing that full-on regeneration, revegetation program that had been planned. That would have actually stood in the way of the much more effective natural regeneration. So we sort of had to step back, which is great. So we now have a bit of a a strategy for wetland revegetation. Key to restoration for local wetlands up in the Hepburn is to remove the transformer weeds. We now have some evidence that local wetlands have high restoration potential, regeneration potential. So actually putting a wait and see period into our programs is something we want to do ongoing. Might not fit with most grant programs, but it's a really essential thing to do. Some weeds can be crucial to retain, as we're about to see, and follow-up, of course, is essential. Remember, those willows are seeding from adjoining untreated areas. But this approach has its challenges with the community. Doing a wait and see, a community are desperate. When are the tree guards coming? When are the trees coming? And in our community, we actually have some different opinions on the value of restoration, on using big machinery, using chemicals. We have a lot of opposition locally. We have to rebuild the trust that nature can do the job and that council can do the job. So our diverse community perspectives is probably evidenced by headlines like this in the local paper, willow pane in Smeaton, where the willows have been removed and people are very affected by the change in their landscape. And of course, we're the home of permaculture, so this is a long piece by David Holmgren about the removal of the willows at Lake Jubilee, which is something he objected to, the wind where the willows are. These views are often based on utility values, different value systems, aesthetic values, cultural values. Here we have a piece from someone who really appreciates being able to collect willows for basket weaving from the Lake Dalesford area. Of course, you know, Peter Andrews advocating for willows' value for farmland hydrology. And of course, we often have this cultural background, often from Europe, of willows as being a wonderful thing and part of our cultural heritage, and a lot of cultural attachment to willows in our area. And even on ecological imperatives, further adoption of things like Holmgren has called these willows the willow everglades, and points out their value perhaps in removing silt from the waterways. Calls the removal of the willows at Lake Jubilee before they are done grossly irresponsible. So for these reasons, this communication is really valuable for us to test our assumptions and to check, do we have community support when we're doing this work? Unfortunately, projects can become bound up, especially when people are talking across value systems and across knowledge systems, when they have different foundations for their knowledge. And some projects, including Lake Jubilee, it was actually curtailed due to this sort of argy-bargy going on in the community. And yeah, community can devalue the projects and the outcomes because they remember this sort of argy-bargy. Fortunately, we have a flagship. Now, what is a flagship? A flagship is a community engagement concept, species whose story tells a wider conservation issue. It provides a face, so your ecological restoration is no longer an abstract sort of maybe thing in the future. It gives a face to our work. And it embodies the positive change being sought. And koalas, of course, are the ultimate flagship species for forest protection, for ethical toilet paper, for responsible pet ownership, and they embody our vision of safe koalas in the landscape. And at Lake Jubilee, I was trudging across the sedge in 2021 and I found this unfamiliar butterfly, which is called the bright-eyed brown butterfly. And I looked it up and found out that it had never been recorded from Daylesford before in the Atlas of Living Australia or iNaturalist. There were records from 1906 from Trentham. And I found out that it's a wetland-dependent butterfly, and it was pretty special. It's not a threatened species, but perhaps it should be. Populations in the Grampians haven't been located for several decades despite searches. It's a cool climate species. It's mostly found in alpine areas, so it's climate change vulnerable. It is a wetland species, so of course wetlands are highly degraded, and it's also a species, thank you, it's a species with real challenges. So it's also not a very good flyer, so it's not great at dispersing widely. So I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. It's pretty cool that we've got these at our restoring wetland. So it was at Jubilee Lake, and then a week later, I found it at Wombat Flat in the same restoration area where things were happening at Wombat Flat. And a little later that day, I rushed off to Trentham, and I found it at two locations where community had been removing willows and blackberry, and wetland restoration had been happening there as well. And they were all over the place. It was really cool. And that's partly because the caterpillar of this butterfly only feeds on tall sedge, Carex suppressor. And there were thousands of these plants had regenerated in the wetland areas that we'd done. I talked to some experts and they said the really important nectar food plant for the adult butterfly is prickly tea tree, which we didn't have in our wetlands, apart from a few planted ones at Trentham, where this butterfly was whizzing around absolutely happy as Larry. In a bit of a twist, almost everywhere the butterflies were, they were feeding on exotic forbs, creeping buttercup, bird's foot trefoil, clover. So in the short term at least, those weeds are actually now a really critical part of their habitat. What's been happening for the last 100 years? Where have they been? They've been hanging on in areas like this at Chinese Spring in Trentham, just on the edges of the willow thickets, just in the areas where a few sedges, a few flowers have been surviving. That's our impression. So I think it makes a great flagship for ecological restoration because we've got strong evidence that they're impacted by habitat degradation. They respond really well and really fast to restoration efforts. They're present. If they're present or likely to recolonise, that is also a good thing for a flagship to do. They're demonstrably reliant on a particular habitat that we're working on, and they're visible to the wider community. Butterflies are great because they're well known, they're very obvious, their habits are really well studied. And it really helps if they're cute. Do you think a rare mosquito for this wetland would be as good a flagship as this butterfly? It's also likely to be a focal species. By protecting this butterfly, we're likely to help other things like the beautiful orange and blue robberfly that we don't know anything about down there. The local group in Trentham who'd done that great work, they received a council grant and to do a tiny little bit of extension of habitat right on the main street of Trentham, Butterfly Corner they call it. At a recent talk, they expressed how much the butterfly story actually gave them great hope and energy for the work that they've been doing. The LGBTQI community, with their Grove of Gratitude now 3 or 4 years, have also adopted the butterfly as part of their festival. In fact, last year they called it Spread Your Wings. Find Your Wings was the festival theme based on the butterfly story, and they've continued to work and do maintenance on their site at Wombat Flat. And things are coming full circle. The butterfly is also telling us about restoration work, and Mandy talked about that circularity, that cycles of doing restoration work. This farmer asked us to come on because they were considering come onto his property because he wanted to know if the butterfly and whether that would support doing some grazing reduction along the creek line here in Trentham. CMA brought us in, and it turned out the next door neighbour had already been doing grazing exclusion, and I was able to watch the butterflies cross across the fence, and guess which side of the fence they preferred to spend their time on. Within just a few minutes, you could actually see the butterflies obviously preferring to spend their time on the ungrazed wetland there. So a really simple restoration would be just to exclude some of the grazing on that left-hand side. The butterflies told us we really need to get some of those flowering shrubs into our revegetation sites because they're not naturally regenerating. There's no nearby seed source for those. So getting prickly tea tree and Bosseria into the wetland margins. And also this last flying season, we got to see the butterfly in a near pristine environment on the Colonised River. And for the first time, I feel like we now have a reference site that we can actually work to for these very degraded wetlands that we've been working on that are restoring themselves beautifully, but where will they go to? What should we be trying to reintroduce? And this site here was a really good example. Yeah, nature is the best teacher. So this butterfly has actually been helping us to learn about doing restoration better and how to bring the community on board for this work, because it's quite a leap of faith to take time and to stop doing our busy bee work and let nature do a bit of the work for us. Okay, thank you.
My question's to Brian. What would you have done if you actually did have a budget?
Cool. Yeah, I've thought about that one myself. I reckon when I'd come from Merri Creek, where, we're very used to doing everything the kitchen sink, I probably would have not had the guts to actually wait, or wouldn't have had the knowledge. Fortunately, I didn't know what I was doing when I got to council. And there wasn't plans, so we actually had that chance to actually step back and look, or the fortune that we didn't have the money. Now I'm actually much more confident. I've come from Merri Creek had much lower restoration potential in most of its areas, certainly on its wetland areas. Here I've had the proof that natural restoration can be trusted to do quite a lot of work, and we're currently actually putting that wait and see period into a new project now with the CMA. So no, I probably would have made the mistake earlier on and tried to plant it all up and would have made a big mess. I guess one of the things, I think they were a bit lucky. You saw how much mud and disturbance had been created. I think they were lucky with the sedges and rushes. They quite enjoyed that environment, and maybe they were very fortunate with their timing. So I'd love to get a bit more documentation of what sequence happened there, because it all happened without me knowing.
Massive thanks to our forum sponsors: City of Yarra, DNA Training, Arbour Green, Merri Creek Management Committee, Ecological Consultants Association Victoria, Stantec Australia, Global Green Environmental, NRM Jobs, and Nature Links. Arbour promotes the study and practice of ecological restoration and fosters and encourages effective management of Australia's natural areas by qualified people based on sound ecological principles. Join us to help promote good work practices, to strengthen our industry and network with like-minded people. Thanks for visiting Regen TV. Call by again soon for more restoration content you can trust.